Hi there. Welcome to Beyond the Comfort Zone podcast. My name is Isra Ishaq from Physiotherapist Fitness and Nutrition. On this podcast, I'll be interviewing experts about the various topics taught in fitness education to better understand the research, challenge some beliefs and biases, and provide helpful information to all the other health and fitness professionals out there who may have questions just like mine. Without further ado, let's get on with the show. Now, please remember that this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. See you soon. Hi everyone, welcome to the second episode of the Beyond the Comfort Zone podcast. I'm super excited about this episode because it is about one of my favorite topics of all time, and this is diastasis recti. And I'm even more excited to introduce to you our guest for today, Munira Hudani. Hey Munira.
Hi.
How are you doing?
I am doing great. Thank you for having me.
I am so excited to finally have you here. I know I always message you with questions and queries, and you're always there to help. So it's really, really nice to finally have you here. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about who you are for those who don't know who you are?
Okay, sure. So I am a physiotherapist by training, and I've been in the field for a little over a decade now. And for the most part of my career, it has been in pelvic health and specifically in women's health. And so I have been able to see a lot of women who are prenatal and postnatal. And through that, I have developed a passion as well for diastasis. And I have just been so curious as well about the condition. And at times I had struggled with it, like not personally, but struggled with helping my own patients with it. Yeah. So I realized a lot of the things that I was doing before, they simply weren't working for everybody. So I really had to question what I was doing and the reasons why things were working and why they weren't working. I ended up basically going on a massive quest to find out some more answers. And I think it essentially came down to how I was looking at it and how we in general are framing what diastasis is. And so after I sort of changed that in my mind and came up with this new, idea of what I can do for my clients who have it, then it sort of led to an improvement in their outcomes, but also an improvement in how they were feeling about themselves along the way.
Yeah, which is big, right? Because there is this a fear around diastasis, which is what we're going to kind of get into. But first, what is it? There's like a million definitions of diastasis out there. So how do you define it? What is diastasis recti to you?
So diastasis rectus abdominis, DRA, or DR, diastasis rectus. So what it is, just the classic definition, it's a widening of the linea alba that typically occurs in pregnancy. So it is something that we are referring to as a pregnancy-related condition, although it can be something that occurs outside of pregnancy. Some men get it. Men who tend to have some additional central obesity can have some diastasis, as well as the almost opposite scenario where men who are very athletic and very much into strengthening and toning and who have a lot of definition in their abdomen can also get it as well. Going back to pregnancy-related diastasis, it's just a phenomenon that occurs in pregnancy. And so what ends up happening after pregnancy is actually a few things. There can be a number of different scenarios of what one may present with afterwards, and some of them may not have anything to do with the linea alba. But after pregnancy, what has typically been associated or kind of linked to diastasis are things like having something called a mummy tummy, where it's described as just sort of this pooch in the lower abdomen. There may often be some just general roundedness in the abdomen as well. It doesn't only have to be in the lower abdomen. There can be just general rounding of the abdomen, distension of the abdomen. You could certainly have postpartum a scenario where actually there's not much change in the overall look of the abdomen, but someone can still feel really weak. And so there may not be an aesthetic component there, but there is a certain sense of weakness that's there after being pregnant. And then the other thing is you may have, like the telltale sign is what we see is that sort of strip down the midline where when it's under pressure, when we do something that creates a rise in pressure, that there's this thing called doming. So that's really a telltale sign of what is considered diastasis. Mm-hmm. So as you can see, there's actually a lot of different things that can be kind of clumped into what diastasis is. If we look at that classic definition of a widened linea alba or thinned linea alba that occurs in pregnancy, and we go back and compare to all of those things that someone could present with, you could see not all of that actually has to do with the linea alba, and some of it doesn't have to do with it at all. So
yeah, and over the recent years, I mean 10, 15 years ago, we didn't talk about diastasis as much. At least I didn't. Even when I started doing what I'm doing, which is about 5-6 years ago, we didn't do much about diastasis, right? But recently there has been so much information on it, which is great because then moms can get help and all these things. But the other side of the coin is there's a lot of misinformation around diastasis as well, which again builds a lot of fear around it, a fear on how to manage it. Now, where do you think that fear is coming from?
Well, the fear is something that is so prevalent with diastasis. And, you know, I think it basically comes down to how we were looking at it, how we were defining it, how we were framing it, the paradigm we were using to approach diastasis. And that paradigm has changed over time. Yeah. And whereas initially it used to be a very linea alba kind of gap-centric scenario or paradigm where initially we would look at only the linea alba and specifically the size, the width of the linea alba. And in that same kind of paradigm, the approach to that was to do exercises that reduce the size of the gap. And so initially it was more about rectus abdominis strengthening using sort of splinted crunches. But then it kind of changed into, yes, we need to focus on closing the gap, but then it became a bit more TA focused. So we need to use the TA because it pulls everything in. But then it was the complete opposite because someone who may have been saying, let's do TA stuff was now literally saying, do not do crunches. Whereas right before that approach came into be, it was all about crunches, and now there's a completely opposite viewpoint on it. So we had these sort of competing ideas, and part of that approach was also one of protecting the tissue, protecting the linea alba, protecting the core, and really minimizing movement and minimizing the amount of strain and stress that goes through that area. So there was like just a pull back of doing exercises and just kind of going back to just doing the most basic gentle things because we really want to preserve this tissue, protect it. And so this was how we were seeing it before. This was our understanding of it before. And then more recently it's changed, you know, where now we have these ideas of like tension, tensioning the linea alba, and actually maybe that should be the goal, is to tension. And this came through studies by the likes of Diane Lee and Paul Hodges that came out more recently. So we had a massive paradigm shift that only occurred, I think it was 2015 when the study came out, but it takes a long time for whatever we used to do to actually change. And so we are currently living in an online world where all of these options are out on the table. And then even more recently, there's a sort of new and emerging approach to diastasis, which actually now takes a look and considers more of the whole abdominal wall rather than just the linea alba, and including the linea alba as just one part of the whole picture. So the approach there is to look at the other contributing factors that may be kind of resulting in the core weakness and in the appearance of the core. So which means the solution to that is to pretty much do exercises that were the ones that were advised against, and they now become the solution. So now we almost have 4 different ideas here, and you can see that all of this is out there. So depending on who is putting out the information and the paradigm they're using, their understanding of it, where they currently are, it will really show in what they're saying and how they're educating about it. And so if now someone else is, a mom who is pregnant and going online, it is not uncommon now for someone to be inundated with information that is conflicting across the board. So that pretty much leads to a halt, a complete stop in what they are doing, because now one thing says don't do crunches, one says do crunches, one says don't rotate, one says rotate as much as you want, or it's conflicting and it's contradictory. So so where does it come from? It basically comes from our understanding and how we used to understand it, and that doesn't go away when it changes, when new approaches develop over time.
Absolutely. And do you think that is due to the fact that we don't really know what causes it? Because you get some mums who can have diastasis and it goes back, they adapt back postpartum without needing any help. And you have other mums who have to work on it a little bit harder. Do you think that's why we're kind of going, okay, let's try this, let's try that, maybe this will work? Do you think that's why? I mean, as in we don't know what's really causing it?
Well, I think that's a huge piece, is we don't really know what causes it, if it can be prevented, if it can be minimized in pregnancy. And so that's a big part of it, because like you said, someone can certainly be pregnant, but we don't really have the ability to say this person is going to end up postpartum with lingering weakness and lingering laxity in their connective tissue. There seems to be a genetic component for sure. So you could have 3 individuals who maybe have the same amount of stretching their first pregnancy, the same amount of stretching in the abdomen, and one afterwards will have more weakness, maybe present with that mummy pooch. And one may have just a little bit of maybe laxity in the skin layer on top, and not so much just not so much roundedness, but maybe more of a superficial layer of issues there. And then someone could maybe not have any issues at all. So there is a genetic component. We do know from research that those who have diastasis tend to have less type 3 collagen, which is the type of collagen that's more responsible for it's the elastic part of collagen, not elastin, but the collagen that is a bit more elastic in nature. So that recoiling action of collagen comes from the type 3. And so certain individuals that have diastasis have been shown to not have potentially that kind of collagen. And, we certainly see individuals who've had twins, who have a twin pregnancy or multiples, and they might be fine as well. So it really is difficult at this point to say who in their pregnancy, after after they have delivered, if they will have some lingering issues. We don't have that answer right now, unfortunately. And that can be, I would say that can be the hardest thing for someone to hear, because what they want to do is prevent things, right? We as professionals, we want to support our clients and our patients in being able to do some things in a more preventative measure and manner, but we may not actually be able to do that. It's possible that we might be able to minimize. We have some research that does support the idea that when it comes to just the linea alba itself, some research has shown that we might be able to minimize how much of widening occurs in the linea alba postpartum through certain exercises that occur in pregnancy. We don't have a lot of those studies. So in terms of preventing, doesn't look like we can prevent it. In terms of minimizing it, it's possible. But I love your questions because they're always about like, well, what does that mean? If we say we can minimize it, then how can that be received on the other end?
Right.
And this is the thing, when we're saying to someone, you can minimize it, you can prevent it, we have to be very careful with that because A, there just isn't a lot of study or research behind it. But B, more importantly, if we say to someone they can do this exercise program and it's going to minimize things, you do this and it'll minimize things, and they happen to be someone that after they deliver they do have some additional weakness and laxity, and they aren't able to fit back into their clothes, and they are struggling with their cores, now they're going back and they're blaming themselves and questioning, what did I do in pregnancy? Maybe I shouldn't have done anything at all, or maybe I did too much, or maybe I just should have backed off a little bit. Like they're going back and questioning if they had a role in what happened afterwards. So we do need to be a bit careful and cautious in how we say things and how we sort of present what we can do with them.
Yeah, absolutely, because you do see a lot of marketing along the lines of, a program will help you prevent diastasis in pregnancy, and in my head I'm thinking, yeah, because diastasis has to happen in pregnancy, right? I mean, research shows us that a baby has to grow, a baby needs room, things are going to change. So yeah, I think that kind of messaging can be really harmful,
Yeah.
Right. My next question is, you hear a lot of the words being used like heal diastasis, right? Do you see diastasis as an injury or just an adaptation that has to happen in pregnancy that carries on postpartum?
Right. So that is something.
This is a loaded question. I totally know.
There is, but this is a question that a lot of people have, and the word injury is being thrown around a lot out there. So, and I understand the reasoning behind it. I understand that it could present as an injury. I personally am a little bit hesitant in using that term, and I can talk about that in a second. But we do see that a lot of times we have people saying, oh, I'm weak because of the fact that I've got diastasis. Oh, I have more distension in my stomach because of my diastasis. I can't exercise my core because of my diastasis. And so what that does is it sort of leads them to believe that they have to fix their diastasis in order to have a stronger core, that they need to fix their diastasis in order to have a flatter stomach, and then fix their diastasis in order to be able to do all the hard exercises that they want to do again. So when we take all of those ideas and say, well, it's because of your diastasis, then naturally we're inclined to think that that's what we need to do, is go in and fix it, so all of that can then go away, when we know that's just not true, and that's not an accurate picture there. So like, what does it mean to have diastasis? Well, then the question, unfortunately, I think the answer is very unsatisfying. It's like, well, we don't really know then what it means to have a diastasis. But what we do know is that, if you're weak, it's probably because you've got weakened core muscles. And if you have more distension, it's probably a combination of factors that's creating that, not just the linea alba, but a combination of muscle weakness and connective tissue of the entire abdomen. And it's quite inconclusive if diastasis in and of itself is linked to or caused or is even associated with things like low back pain, prolapse, and stress urinary incontinence. So does diastasis cause all of that? It's inconclusive there. So again, I think what we need to do is take a step back and consider what happened to the whole abdomen. Look at the core, look at how it's functioning, look at all the muscles, look at the linea alba, look at everything. Yeah. And then we can kind of see where the linea alba plays its role inside of all that, how thin it might be, if maybe there's an extra potential for hernia development, depending on how thin the tissue is there. But really, we just need to do that whole let's just take a little bit of a more global, holistic approach. And then we are kind of given more ideas on what we can do to help the situation rather than if we're just looking at that linea alba. And then I mentioned that I'm sort of hesitant to call it an injury. And the reason is because when we have someone that has stretched out and strained connective, well, it's stretched out and thin connective tissue and it's muscle weakness. So when we have that and we call that an injury, the thing is we know that in and of itself is not contraindication to exercise. Having thin connective tissue and muscle weakness is not a contraindication to exercise, when in fact exercising is most likely what is actually needed to help restore those tissues. So when we call it an injury, we can potentially create some fear around someone who needs to go through a strengthening process, but they're afraid to do that because they feel injured. So they go into protective mode instead. And we know that someone who is more maybe presenting with more thinness and connective tissue laxity and muscle weakness, we know that they actually need strengthening, and that it doesn't mean that they're weak, and it doesn't mean that they're that they can't strengthen themselves or that they're not going to get stronger. So having all of that being called an injury, I tend to hold back because of what it can do on a sort of mental, emotional level to my clients. And so what I tend to say to my clients and patients instead is just, we are dealing with muscle weakness, connective tissue weakness, and we're going to build it up. We're going to strengthen them, and we're going to do it progressively, and we're going to load gradually. And I kind of just leave it in those terms, so they feel a bit more at ease around what's going on with their core.
Yeah, and I totally understand when you say we haven't got a lot of conclusive answers, because we don't know, right? But I think it's important to talk about this so that we can get the messaging right, so people can stop being scared about it. Like you've got diastasis, okay, we can get you stronger, we can work on it, you can eventually do the exercises that you want to do, well, progress to those exercises, and that kind of sort of removes the fear around the whole thing, as opposed to not talking about it, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay. So my next big question is, can someone's diastasis profile remain exactly the same even though they're getting stronger? You know, can someone's abdominal wall get stronger without their diastasis profile change at all?
Right. So that is a fantastic question. And so I think to answer that question, we actually have to consider a couple of things.
Okay.
The first thing we want to consider is, does reducing the interrecti distance lead to an improvement in strength, in abdominal strength? So for that, if we do look at the research, when we are looking at the first 12 months postpartum, we do know from several research studies that there is some change and reduction in interrecti distance over the first 12 months. Naturally, the linea alba will become more narrow over that period of time after someone has had their baby. We also know from that same study that there seems to be an improvement in trunk muscle strength. Yeah. So yes, you can have a reduction in interrecti distance that can be associated with an improvement in strength. However, if you continue to look a little bit deeper, we also know from other studies in that same period of time, we have structural changes and improvements that occur in also that rectus abdominis muscle itself. The one that was pretty much stretched out a lot in pregnancy and widened and thinned, where that muscle also undergoes its sort of process of natural resolution, where it becomes thicker, the cross-sectional area of that muscle becomes smaller. And so there's an improvement in that muscle at the same time as an improvement in the linea alba. So we can't just say, and also from that study, we know that it has been associated with an improvement in trunk muscle strength as well, and especially trunk flexor strength. So basically, we have studies that support the idea that there's an improvement in strength when there is a reduction in interrecti distance, when that linea alba becomes more narrow. But we also have, in that same period of time, postpartum, an improvement in other things too, like the muscles. So is it only because of the linea alba? I'm inclined to say it's actually, there's a lot more becoming resolved in that period of time that's contributing to the improvement in strength. So these are in women. These two studies that I'm referring to are specifically in the postpartum period in that first year, not talking about doing exercises and core exercises. This is just a follow-up kind of study. But the other thing we need to consider is, if someone's diastasis profile doesn't change, would that stop them from making further changes in strength, further improvements in their strength? And so the thing is, regardless of, I guess what we have to do for that is to consider then, are there other reasons why someone can have an improvement in abdominal strength beyond the linea alba? And I think we can both easily say yes, we can have changes in abdominal strength through strengthening the muscles. So if part of the weakness that we're noticing postpartum is because of weakened muscles and not because of the linea alba, once these muscles undergo a strengthening program, we will notice a change in strength, and that really has nothing to do with the linea alba. So there are other reasons why someone's abdomen and strength can change that have nothing to do with the linea alba. But what we can do, what I tend to do, is actually separate them. Rather than saying the linea alba, when it narrows, it's going to make it easier for you to become stronger, and it's going to help you in your strengthening, and it's actually separate. Whatever happens to the linea alba may or may not influence the strength gains that you make. Strengthening is usually the result of the loading process. And again, what's going on in the linea alba actually might benefit from the strengthening itself. But the linea alba is sort of, what's going on there is kind of happening a little bit as a separate phenomenon. So I guess it's a little bit of a, it's a kind of a long-winded answer, but basically there's a lot more to consider. It's not just the linea alba.
Absolutely. Like you said, and this is one of the things I loved about your course, Munira, which is what we're going to talk about at the end. I loved how it was all laid out and explained. It was just amazing, and we'll get to that in the end. Thank you. My next question is, in a lot of the courses that you see, they've defined diastasis, they've divided it into, you know what I'm going to ask, right? Into a functional and dysfunctional.
Yeah.
What is the difference between the two? And at what point does one move from a functional or dysfunctional and vice versa?
Yeah. So when it comes to functional and non-functional diastasis, so I mean, the words function and dysfunction can be used in many other ways and in other contexts, but just specifically the diastasis context.
Yeah.
Functional means when we are going in and assessing the ability of the deep core muscle system, and really specifically it's the TA, the ability of the TA to contract enough so that it can tension the linea alba. It can take up all the slack in the linea alba. Right. And so and that's considered functional. So that just means that when we're going in and palpating, we're feeling that it's initially just soft at rest. It's kind of, just, it's softer, but when they engage their TA, it becomes firmer. It becomes more thicker. There's a change from rest. So that's what's considered in the world of diastasis functional. And if we're not noticing there is a change there and it still remains soft and slack, then it's considered non-functional. There are some challenges with this term and with this assessment, specifically the fact that it's limited to the supine position. In supine, that's where we are assessing function versus non-functional. And so how much does that translate to what actually the core is capable of doing in an upright position? I don't know if it does translate that well. So it doesn't provide us with too much information. I think the other challenge in using the word functional and non-functional is that, you know, we know what we're saying potentially to our clients, our patients, that, okay, we're feeling the tension in the linea alba, we're feeling that it's not, if there's no tension being produced, so therefore, okay, we're saying it's a non-functional diastasis. We know in our minds that this is for the linea alba, but the word functional and dysfunctional, or I guess functional and then non-functional, when our patients hear the word non-functional, it's very easy for them to just sort of take that to the next step. Okay, non-functional, maybe that's dysfunctional. Oh, maybe I have a dysfunctional core. Dysfunctional core, maybe that means my core is just not working very well. Maybe my core is actually a bit broken. Actually, maybe I have an injury here. I have a non-functional core, and so maybe I should be really even more careful and cautious with my exercises because I've been told my core is dysfunctional. So they may easily sort of maybe turn it around or connect their own dots, and it can really perpetuate a sense of fear if we're not careful in how we're describing it. So a simple term like functional versus non-functional can certainly be received as, in the end, as something that is like my core is broken. Yeah, it can be taken to that degree. So again, we do need to be a little bit more aware and mindful of how we are wording things, and the way maybe we can say that to ourselves, but as professionals, but if we're using those words with our clients, I believe we should be spending a little bit more time just to explain what all that means, if it's even necessary to do that at that point. Maybe it'll just be too much information for people. So what I tend to do instead of calling something functional and non-functional, again, because it's really just what we are feeling in the supine position, functional versus non-functional, it cannot really be assessed in the other positions in that classical way of assessing function. We can look for a whole bunch of other things in the other positions instead that will really help us understand the functioning of the core in those positions. But when it comes to using the word function and non-functional, I tend to instead just kind of describe, oh, okay, so I'll basically go through something like this. I'll tell my patients, okay, can you engage your TA? And I'm feeling for what's happening in the supine position. And I'm feeling the linea alba. Okay, I don't feel very much. Can you do a little bit more? Can you try to engage a little bit harder? Let's see what happens there. And if it does produce a little bit more tension there, then great. I'll be like, oh, okay, that's wonderful. Let's see now what you can produce and what happens in this position. And let's compare that to what we felt in the supine position. Let's compare that now to what we feel in sitting, and let's compare that to standing. Okay, so now that we've felt your linea alba after you've engaged in all of these different positions, we can see which ones really let you produce the most amount of tension there. And so these positions, like the standing or the sideline, might be the best ones for you. So let's use these exercise positions and find some exercises to do there, because they're going to give you the biggest bang for your buck in really targeting that connective tissue that's there. So I will make it a little bit more wordy, but I will word it in a way that just allows them to see, oh, these are much better positions for me. I can exercise in these ones. The other ones are not harmful or damaging. They're not going to, create any injury or anything like that. They just may not be very helpful in facilitating changes in those tissues.
So the words and the language that we use really, really does matter in terms of how our clients perceive their conditions and that their well-being, right?
Completely. Yeah, completely. And this is something that I personally am still trying to get better at. It's not that I am perfect, and I will certainly say like functional, non-functional, it will come out, but I just try my best to be very mindful and present when I'm there, and aware of what I'm saying and how it could potentially be received. And I feel like just by making that a more conscious effort, we are able to really help our patients in a more of an empowering way versus really creating a fearful experience for them.
It's a journey. It's a journey for all of us, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly.
All right. So I'm gonna go back into something that you mentioned before, which is doming. Right. This is
Okay.
another big scary thing. Like you should never dome in an exercise, otherwise you're weak. Right. So what is doming and what does it mean?
So doming is, again, it's something that is quite specific to someone that has a wider linea alba, where we are able to see the effect of increased intra-abdominal pressure on the linea alba, where we see that the linea alba sort of pushes outwards and it sort of out pockets a little bit, and we're able to see that it goes beyond, let's say, the abdominal wall. It sort of extends beyond the abdominal wall. And so that's what doming typically is, but it's usually the net result of intra-abdominal pressure and one's core strategy, what they're doing with their core, potentially the position that they're in as well. But doming doesn't mean, when you see doming, it doesn't mean that that person is weak. Doming in one position doesn't mean that they're weak in all the positions and all the exercises. And doming in that position also doesn't mean, again, that they're weak even in that position. It could be just the way that they're doing the exercise, it's producing more doming. Or it could be that the muscles are just not kind of set up in a way to be able to really contract well and reduce the doming. It's possible that doming really is just something that is occurring because of the status of the tissues that are there, and not really because there's an actual weakness in muscle strength. So when it comes to doming, there are different grades of doming. You always want to put things into context, and I would say especially for doming, you want to do that as well, because there is a little bit of doming that you might see, and there may be a lot of doming that you might see, and there may be actually something which is the opposite scenario, which is that invagination of the linea alba. So the linea alba can present in many different ways when someone is doing an exercise. And so I think by putting it into context and kind of seeing how much doming is happening there, and then determining if those tissues are in fact being stretched out to their end limit, fully being stretched out, and if so, if that person is unable to have any sense of control and reduce that doming, that would be the scenario where I would want to work on, and I would sort of scale back or try different ways of doing that exercise if doming that we're seeing is presenting like that, where it's a lot of doming. And when you go and you feel it, this is what we call the hard dome. And this is something that Anthony Lowe really has provided us with this lovely analogy. So it's the hard dome, where when you go in and you feel like on the linea alba when someone is doming, and if you go and you feel it starts to feel like a balloon that's been fully inflated. Like there's going to be some give, but it's going to be quite resistive to being pushed in. You won't be able to reduce it manually. But if you go and you feel the linea alba, and it can be quite easily reduced through just a light pressure of your fingers, like a partially inflated balloon, and you go and push on something like that, then you're not straining the tissues. The tissues are not under full stretch. So like I said, there are different grades of doming, different levels of it. I think when we see doming, it's easy to jump to a conclusion to say that, well, that we see doming, that means you're weak. We got to stop this. Oh, okay, that means your core is not working well. And so again, going back to how are we wording this? How are we talking about this and explaining this to our patients and clients? And if we see that there's doming there, really, again, we just want to avoid that scenario where it's an uncontrolled sort of maximum amount of stretching on that tissue where they have no ability to reduce it and really minimize the amount of time that they spend there. That would be my own, I guess, approach to doming, where I just spend much less time in that sort of scenario. And then when it comes to doming, and basically this, like I said, it's a combination of the amount of pressure and the core strategy. So when we're just talking about the core strategy that one might be using, we can see all sorts of things going on with the core when someone is doing any kind of exercise. So some of those strategies may lead to more doming, some of them may lead to less doming. And you can certainly have those same kinds of strategies be present even in those who don't have diastasis, who haven't had children yet. So, or even in men, we could see this as well. So it can come down to the core strategy as well. And then when we're looking at it from that angle, then we know that there's many things that can contribute to what they're doing with their core and their core strategy and their access to the different strategies that they may have. And lots of things can influence what they're doing with their muscles in that given day. So, certainly how you're feeling will play a role in that. You can imagine one day you're feeling on top of the world. Yeah. You are having a great day. You go to the gym and it's just, you go to every machine that you want to do or every weight that you want to lift and you are managing to do it well. You feel like you can do more than the week before and you're just, you're unstoppable. And so the week after, nothing has really changed in the exercises or the weights that you're lifting, but it just has been a stressful day at work, or there's just a lot of stuff going on at home and you got a lot on your plate and you just haven't had a good night's sleep. And now you go to the gym and you try to do the exact same exercises. And then you realize, okay, I just, I'm not, this just feels so much harder this time. I can't lift what I did last week. So what you're doing, how our bodies are being, the muscles are being recruited inside of the exercises we're doing is not just purely biomechanical. Absolutely, fatigue and stress and personal situations, circumstances, nutrition, and inflammatory, having more of an inflamed system can certainly play a role in how the muscles are operating too. So that comes down to the core strategy. Yeah. Angle of it. But yeah, there's lots more to consider to doming. It's not just that, you have doming and that person's weak. And that's also not true.
Yeah, the psychosocial aspect of it really does come into play. I have a friend, she's a physiotherapist, and she said one of her clients, he hasn't got diastasis, but the day when he's stressed out, he domes massively because, you're stressed. Your body's stressed, things are not working the way they used to work. So, yeah.
Exactly.
It all matters, right? All right, let's dive into hernias now. This is such a cool conversation. Okay, so what is a hernia? And the next important question is, does one need to have diastasis to have a hernia?
Okay.
Yeah.
So a hernia is when an organ or some tissue, it exits or comes through tissues that are supposed to contain it and hold it in. So typically hernias, we're referring to something in the abdominal region that can be in the front and anterior aspect of the abdomen, or it could be at the lower superior aspect of the abdomen. So in the inguinal and femoral regions, there can be hernias that occur there. But usually when we're talking about hernias and in this sort of postpartum population, we're really looking more specifically and referring to hernias that occur in and around the umbilicus.
Yeah.
And potentially a little bit higher than that. And anything higher than that is usually referred to as an epigastric hernia. So a hernia, there are several contributing factors to what creates a hernia. There has to be some level of, typically what causes a hernia, it's sort of thinning of the muscles, weakening of the muscles, and weakening of the tissues. And in addition to that, repeated strain, repeated physical strain and stress. So there has to typically be both of these two factors that then can lead to the conditions where a hernia can occur. So repeated strain and repeated pressure on that tissue. So in diastasis, so going back just a little bit, taking 2 steps back, if we're not talking about the postpartum population, just in general, if there is repeated strain on the tissue there, that can be what leads to the thinning of the tissue, and it can lead to then the hernia occurring. But now what we're doing in the postpartum population is we have to consider that some individuals that have diastasis do have already the thinned out tissue. Before we were just saying the pressure and the repeated load can create thinning. Postpartum, we have some individuals who now already present with that thin tissue. So some women will have to be a bit more, I guess, mindful of how they are doing exercises and not spending time in that really hard dome scenario where that stretched out tissue is staying stretched and there's just no control in that scenario over the dome. Not everybody that has diastasis is going to be at risk of a hernia. Every individual will present uniquely. So some individuals who have diastasis actually have, maybe they'll have a 3-finger interrecti distance or gap, and their tissue in between is actually quite dense and the integrity of that linea alba is quite good. But there is just a widened linea alba, but the tissue inside of the linea alba is actually quite good. And some individuals will have more thinning inside of that tissue. So we're more, I guess, we need to consider the hernia prevention or just those considerations is specifically in those who have really, really thinned out tissues. And when they're performing exercises that are producing excessive doming that they can't control and doing a lot of them. Because remember how hernias occur, it's usually through a repeated amount of strain. So, that's not to say you do a pull-up and you see some doming there that it's going to create it. But if you do that and it's just, you're doing so many of them and that pressure, you can just see it's popping through repeatedly, that's when we do have to be a bit more cautious around the linea alba and what we're doing. And so does everybody who has diastasis need to be concerned about a hernia? No. Are you doing a lot of exercise? First of all, are you participating in really high level, high pressure exercises? A lot of women who have diastasis are not and are more or less sedentary, so they may not be at risk of a hernia. Potentially, depending on how they're lifting their kids. So we have to look at what they're doing physically in their day, in their exercise routines. In addition, we have to consider the connective tissue status that is there.
Got it. Thanks, Munira.
You're welcome.
All right. So you mentioned something before about an association between, I don't know if we have that association or not, between diastasis and lower back pain and pelvic floor condition. Have we got the research that links these 3?
Well, there's lots of research out there, actually, regarding diastasis and incontinence, and diastasis and prolapse, and diastasis and low back pain. We have research out there, and let's just go to incontinence. For the most part, we will have some studies that'll say that there is no correlation between having a wider linea alba and having incontinence, and some that will say there is a positive correlation between wider linea alba and incontinence. And then if you look at some of the systematic reviews that have been recently published, they have shown that they have concluded that there is no correlation between a wider linea alba and having stress urinary incontinence. In the similar systematic review regarding prolapse, there seems to be a weak correlation. So we don't have these strong correlations, which means we really can't be making strong statements of like, let's get working on your diastasis, because if we don't,
Yeah.
then it's going to cause incontinence, or it's going to cause pelvic floor issues down the line. So we really shouldn't be saying stuff like that anyways, but we also don't have research to substantiate that.
Yet you see it all the time.
Right.
We tell
Right.
people this all the time, unfortunately, right?
Yeah. And then the other thing is with the low back pain, again, we have probably the same number of studies that will show that there is a positive correlation, and then the same number that show that there isn't.
Yeah.
So right now, regarding low back pain, it's quite inconclusive. If there is a link, I think there's some unpublished data that might be coming out that supports the idea that there is a strong link, but just anyways, right now, we can't make that association. So just again, we really want to be careful in how we're saying what we're going to do is going to how it's going to benefit our patients. We don't want to say something like, well, let's work on your diastasis because that will help get rid of your low back pain.
Yeah.
That's a statement. Again, it's a bit too bold to say right now. We don't have that research.
Absolutely. Right. I can talk to you all day, Munira. So I'm gonna go with one last question, and I think this is the biggest one of all. Are there any safe and unsafe exercises for that?
Oh, right. That
right.
This $1 million question, right?
Absolutely. So let's talk about it. Have we got a list of safe and unsafe exercises for diastasis?
Well, I can pull up probably 10 for you right now. So we have, they exist, they do exist. So it's interesting with regards to lists. First of all, the creation of lists was certainly well intended.
Yeah.
It also came from the way we were looking at diastasis and how it could be something that really needs to be protected and preserved. So don't do these exercises. It just came down to how we were viewing it. Yeah. But, once you look at this a little bit more closely, you can see that these lists can unnecessarily restrict those who have diastasis and are actually quite capable of doing the exercises, but they're not doing them because it's on a list. So we are really restricting some people who shouldn't be restricted from these exercises because they will be capable and are strong enough and able to do them. Right. And on top of that, and I've mentioned this before as well, but it does also create this false sense of security when we have people following a list of exercises that is supposedly safe, because how we are doing these exercises can certainly they can be done in ways that aren't quote unquote safe, but done in ways that maybe are not really using the muscles well and really are actually stretching tissues beyond their control. So it's really not about the exercise. Typically it comes down to how the exercise is being done. And that's the same for diastasis, also typically the same for prolapse as well. But it's usually not the exercise, but the technique and the how behind the exercise, how it's being done. And then regarding research, do we have any research to support the idea that certain exercises are good, certain exercises are bad? Yeah. Basically, we're asking, do we have research that says that if we do these exercises, they lead to a more wide linea alba, and if we do these other exercises, it leads to a linea alba that doesn't become wider or becomes more narrow? We don't have anything at all to say that. There are ideas and premises of the tissue. Again, the tissues need to be a little bit more protected. We need to be careful. So there are ideas that have been presented in research, usually in the discussion parts of research studies, when some of the researchers will say, okay, we should still be very careful around crunching exercises and this and that. So these ideas are certainly in research, but the topic itself is not something that has been studied. it's not, we don't have data on that. And the very interesting thing, actually, when we look at research, recent research actually, is there are some associations that are being presented now that, some individuals that have diastasis are going to present with more weakness in rotation and more weakness in trunk flexion, so trunk rotation and trunk flexion. And so we have a recent study that supports that. Actually, we've got a few studies that say that those with diastasis will have more difficulty in doing these kinds of tasks. But we can take that in two different ways. We can say, okay, individuals that have diastasis have difficulty doing these two things, so we should be careful around them. Or it's highlighting an area that we need to work on, that there's weakness there, so we actually need to go in and begin strengthening these areas that are weaker, that have now been, let's say, supported by research. So we do need to work on trunk flexion and do need to work on trunk rotation. And because we know that some women that have diastasis will have weakness there. So, and the other thing is, we often see planks inside of diastasis unsafe lists. And planks, in this same study that I'm talking about that had made an association between having diastasis and having more weakness in trunk rotation and trunk flexion, they also found that those who had diastasis had no more difficulty doing a plank than those who didn't have diastasis. It was just as easy for those to do a plank who had diastasis and as those who didn't. So we see that planks are on these lists often that do not do these exercises, this plank exercise, because it is too much or too harmful. But actually, right now, we actually have something that says, well, in fact, those who have diastasis may not have any issues with that at all, so maybe we should remove it from that unsafe list. But in fact, maybe we should just take these lists out of the question in general and take a look at who's in front of us and see what they're capable of doing. And then assess from there what they're capable of doing right now and building up from there. Regardless of the exercise has been on bad or good lists, everyone can do, all exercises are good exercises. It's, can they do them? Can they do them well? Can they do them without that excessive uncontrolled doming? Can they do them without pain, without leaking? Do they have control over their body, control over their core? Like, you're just looking for other things, not just saying that you have diastasis, so don't do this exercise.
Yeah, I think with diastasis, with prolapse and with incontinence and all these things, it's really all down to the execution of the exercise, right? Yeah. And your strategy, and that's it. So it's not so much about the exercise itself, but how you do the exercise. Yeah. Munira, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for coming on. Now, tell us about your amazing course that just came out, that I just completed, like in a few weeks, and I was done. I could not stop.
Well, that is so amazing to hear. And I feel so happy that people are, starting to complete the course now that it's been out for a little bit of time. And so they've had time to go through it, some people. And my mission really is to provide some clarity to diastasis and to really help professionals who are working with individuals that have diastasis, and to help them understand it and help them make sense of why there is so much conflicting information out there, so that when they go and are working with their clients, that they have the information, they can sort of transfer knowledge to them and clear it up for them too. So my mission is to sort of create this global community, or just a unified idea and approach to diastasis, so that we minimize all this confusion that really has led people astray and has really led people into becoming so fearful about their core. And I knew that in order to do that, I had to create something like a course for professionals, so that every time a professional has taken it and has learned this information, they can work with the hundreds and thousands of clients that they have. And so there's this ripple effect that can occur. And so my course is called Diastasis Rectus Abdominis and the Postpartum Core. And it is a course for professionals, health professionals, fitness professionals, rehab professionals, medical professionals. And it gives you, it doesn't just reiterate, concepts that you might already know right now, like tension. And it's a course that's designed to expand your understanding, not just give you what you already know. I don't spend too much time just reading out research. I take the research and I integrate it and give you why that might be important, and really just provide it in a way that I think is more simplistic and sort of step by step. So by the end of the course, you have a much better understanding of diastasis, what kinds of exercises you can do, how you can go about rebuilding the postpartum.
My core is still very sore, by the way, just saying.
Okay. Yeah, so that's what I do is I lay out a series of exercise ideas that you can use from beginning to the most beginning style of exercises to the most advanced exercises, and how to go through that. And it's just a way for you to use as an example, so that you could also take the ideas and principles behind them all that you learn in the course, and can apply that to the exercises you like to do as well. So that was a pretty long answer, but it's a course now that is out there. And if you are interested in taking it, then...
Absolutely. I would recommend everyone who works in the health and fitness, who works with women, who works with mom, who works with athlete, to just take it, because it was absolutely fantastic. And like I said before, I have knowledge on DRA already. I've done other courses, but yeah. I just loved how it was all laid out. It made it really to understand the concepts, and then in the end how you all put them together. It was just brilliant. So really thank you for that. Are you looking to add any other courses out there after this one?
Yes, absolutely. So my next big project is a course on abdominoplasty, post-diastasis repair, surgical repair. So there will be a course coming out at some point in the near future on that specifically. And there will likely be a program that women who are undergoing this procedure, that they can use post-op, or actually pre-op and post-op, so that they have something there as a resource to work through how to get their core back, and then also potentially how to return back to fitness after that. So there's that. There's several projects in the works right now. So there's lots coming out soon, and yeah. So just keep yourself posted, and I will keep you posted if you're at all following me.
Always. Munira, thank you again. Thank you for being here. It was lovely chatting to you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me
back soon and discuss some more. I did have a few other questions, but I want to be respectful of your time. So we'll talk again soon. Thanks again.
We can do a part 2 at some point.
Absolutely. Okay. All right then.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Me too.
Okay. Bye.